Republican Congress. And both of these, in a sense, these really major developments that came out of that whole school of the public interest were very much in line with this idea that in social policy we frequently get results very different from the ones that we hope for. And so I think that as we began the 2000s, there were actually two very contradictory pillars of thought in the neoconservative movement. The one was that very cautionary one about the use of power, but the other one was one that actually approved and legitimated and to some degree celebrated the positive moral uses of American power. And there wasn't really any forum because these two pillars, in a sense, were discussed by completely different groups of people, one doing domestic policy and the other doing foreign policy. There never was an effort or an opportunity, I think, to try to reconcile what were actually quite contradictory points of view of the opportunities for human agency to manipulate social outcomes. And I think what happened in the 2000s is that the power principle won out over the cautionary principle, and that's what led to the result that we had in advocacy of the Iraq War. Another point that I admired about Justin's book is he was very polite today, but he's also, I think, doesn't let neocons off the hook. And in discussing the movement and the way it evolved in the 2000s, I think, as you can infer from his presentation, there was a shift from a more open-ended intellectual pursuit of ideas towards a more, in a sense, closed-minded advocacy of policies where the ends were not so up for grabs. And he accuses that generation of certain real failings, including, and these are not my words, these are his, intellectual laziness, failure to distinguish, for example, between different Islamist and Middle Eastern groups that were giving us trouble, resort to conspiracy theories linking Al-Qaeda and Iraq, failure to acknowledge the fact that the world had changed and there were now non-state actors that were competing with states as sources of power, failure to understand the complexity of social transformations in distant countries. And his other criticism is one of arrogance, of belief in our ability here in Washington to understand very complex issues that are going on in other parts of the world, and then the failure to invest in the kind of knowledge that would make those kinds of decisions or would temper some of the predictions and beliefs that flowed out of those convictions. And I think this is all fair and needs to be taken to heart. Now, actually, EJ has kind of stolen a little bit of my thunder on what I was going to say about the future of neoconservatism, because I would agree with him completely that, as far as I can see, when neoconservatism first appeared, it was a genuinely new position because it really was universalistic and took aspects of the left-wing agenda, that is to say, universal human rights and a progressive view of the possibility of social change, but coupled it with these cautionary kinds of conservative principles, and that was a mix that really had not existed previously. But I think that in the current incarnation, it's either that there's neoconservatism has just evolved into conservatism, as EJ said, or else that some of those neoconservative ideas have simply become mainstream Republican ideas, and it's much harder to see the difference. Bob Kagan tried to do this a couple of years ago in his book, The Return of History and the End of Dreams. I don't know where he got that title, but in which I think he was trying to outline in a kind of post-hegemonic world where you had a return of big powers like Russia and China, what a distinctively neoconservative foreign policy would look like. I actually don't think it's terribly successful because I think he's actually trying to muscle a very different kind of world back into this old familiar bipolar Cold War framework where you've got democracies on the one hand and authoritarian states on the other. And I just don't think it works because, you know, countries like Brazil and South Africa may be democracies, but they just don't have or India, for that matter, really do not have a natural community of interest with the United States. And therefore, I think you're really dealing with a very different kind of world. I think that there's actually a big missed opportunity with regard to a future neoconservatism. One of the things that I've always thought was a weakness in the movement as a whole was its failure to pay enough attention to economics and to come up with a coherent view. And in a sense, there was, you know, the foundations of this. So Bill's father wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. Daniel Bell, a long time ago, wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And it was clear from a lot of this early writing that many neoconservatives simply did not buy into, you know, Friedrich Hayek and libertarian economics and the kind of neoclassical paradigm that was dominant on, you know, on the American right. But for one reason or another, you know, there was a merger and an acceptance basically of the Reagan economic agenda of low taxes and supply side and so on and so forth. And it does seem to me, especially after the financial crisis that we've just gone through, that there's actually a big opportunity for rethinking some of those from a you know, some of the, you know, what's happened both to the United States economy and to the global economy from a point of view that doesn't simply, you know, like neoclassical economists look at economics from an extremely reductionist and very ideological point of view, but that takes moral values seriously, that takes community seriously, that takes national interest seriously. And I think that if you know, people had thought through what the real failures of the free market orthodoxy were that we've just experienced, you actually could come up with a very interesting position that would, you know, be the equivalent of neoconservative for the era that we are entering into. And again, this would lay the seeds for future conflicts because I think if you thought that through, it would then throw into question the tenet about American primacy, because one of the big, you know, challenges we're going to face is that the economic basis for our primacy is fast eroding. So, thank you, but congratulations, Justin, on your book.
Well, thank you. I will join in the praise for Justin's book, and I, of course, will also call him Justin as a neoconservative. I can't, you know, I have to give him the American pronunciation. I'm a little shocked that Frank bowed to such a hegemonic and almost nativist matter of discourse, but that's okay. I'll praise the book, but I won't engage the book, not because I don't think it's worth engaging with, because I think I'd either be defending myself or defending friends or relatives or distinguishing some friends from other friends, and I think all of that would be sort of unseemly, so you all should read the book and make up your own mind. I would say this, and I think Justin would agree with this. You know, many of the thinkers discussed in the book are serious and interesting thinkers, and I have found in life, maybe this is my bias from studying political philosophy originally, that it's usually better to read the thinkers themselves than even very fine accounts of the thinkers, especially when those accounts have a purpose not of simply rendering the thought, but of putting them in context as part with other thinkers as part of a political intellectual movement. So I think it's really worth reading the different thinkers in this book. Most of them are available in essays and books. I include Frank's book on the end of history, which has been caricatured as much as a lot of other neoconservative, or maybe I shouldn't say other, but a lot of the neoconservative books that are caricatured or articles. But you know, the National Public Interest, all 40 years of it is available online at the National Affairs website. Commentaries available online. The Weekly Standards available online. Books by various people are available. So I think you will find a lot more diversity than people realize. I think you will find different intellectual strands. There are Straussians and Burkeans and Madisonians, and there were tensions from the beginning, and there were agreements in practice, even when there were intellectual tensions. I think, honestly, if you look at the at Commentary magazine in the early 80s, the notion that that was a heyday of greatly diverse views about what to do about the Soviet Union, but now there's a kind of uniformity, I think is a little ridiculous. There are different moments when people agree on practical issues and emergencies much more. And there are moments when there doesn't seem to be a practical emergency, and it's easier for magazines to devote space to more sort of speculative thinking about where to go in the future, and these things are partly driven by the moment of time one is in. In any case, I would just say read the thinkers themselves, don't simply read about the thinkers. In a related way, my only other comment about sort of the past, before I get to the future, or the present and the future, is I think it's interesting that Justin calls the book, and I don't quarrel with this, the biography of a movement. My father, preferred, but there's no reason that Justin has to defer to my father on this, neoconservative persuasion, though he originally had used other terms, neoconservative imagination, playing off Trilling's the liberal imagination. He usually was pretty careful to try to say that he didn't really think it was a movement in the classic sense of a movement. There was just too much diversity and heterogeneity in terms of both the actual conclusions people had come to, but also in terms of the influences on those different thinkers and political activists, to the degree that some of them were political activists. I think the term movement, I may be wrong about this, the term intellectual movement is itself an interesting idea, actually. I think I'm not sure that it may be wrong, but the first use of it I know of is in Democracy in America, actually, in part 2 of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he talks about the movement of ideas in the United States. And of course, an intellectual movement is ideas in motion. But ideas, of course, really, ideas qua ideas, not to sound too Platonist or something, are, ideas at rest. And the ideas in motion are ideas engaged with politics, engaged with reality, engaged with current historical circumstances. And therefore, intellectual movements are always complicated things to try to understand and disentangle. And I think Justin makes a good effort at disentangling and reassembling into these three families. But in all honesty, there are lots of other ways one could carve that up, and I think they might be equally legitimate. But movements, ideas in motion are engaged with politics and with reality and with crises and with challenges. And therefore, it's always then hard afterwards, 20, 30, 40 years afterwards, to disentangle what was practical conclusion people came to as opposed to some theoretically grand rethinking. And people don't always tell you that, or in any case, it's always, one would have to go back and read the original sources to decide that. I mean, we live in a certain kind of regime. If you think that the country is going to if you think that the size of government had to be reduced, there was a real argument in the late 70s that one couldn't get there by pursuing more standard conservative economic arguments, that supply-side economics had some truths in it, and some real truths, I think, in terms of economic growth, and still has those truths. It also had a certain political utility that wasn't part of the more standard conservative economic recipe. And if one wanted to actually change economic policy in the United States, one had to think about what a combination of good policy and achievable politics was possible. I would say very much the same is true of foreign policy. I think I wrote a review, this is, utterly unimportant, but Pat Moynihan went to the UN in 75, 76, used a lot of human rights rhetoric. I mean, not just, really made that a centerpiece, I think, of his tenure at the UN, wrote a book about it. And I remember reviewing the book in the American Spectator, this is a long time ago, in the late 70s, when I was a grad student, I guess, or an assistant professor, and saying I wasn't sure that I really agreed as a matter of political theory that American foreign policy should be excessively driven by a concern for universal human rights. On the other hand, this is a democracy based on human rights, and maybe therefore it's appropriate to achieve reasonable ends, a more decent, a more stable, a more peaceful world, a world friendlier to freedom. It's crazy not to somehow embrace the principle of the regime and therefore try to advance that. On the other hand, one can't be excessively dogmatic or radical, or certainly not utopian about doing that. And I would say, parenthetically, I don't honestly think that many neoconservatives were, although everyone thinks we were apparently over the last 10 years. But these are complicated considerations. I mean, in the real world of ideas and politics, and people made judgments, and people differed on judgments. And so you do have in this myriad kind of complex of neoconservatives and political activists, people tactics, because they just had simply a different judgment of what might be prudent at the time. They supported different candidates at different times. You had people who differed on first principles, but actually agreed on tactics. I mean, I would say there were people, just thinking of my father and his friends, there were people who my father was closer to at some fundamental intellectual level, whom he probably disagreed with more in practical politics than other people whom he had more, who came from a very different place, so to speak, intellectually, but who, as it happened, ended up thinking that in the here and now for the next 2, 4, 6 years, these 3 or 4 priorities were awfully important.